Hello, happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday, everyone.
And it is. Are you feeling happier, Matt?
In what? Well, personally,
Are you feeling the warm glow of growth?
No.
Oh,
I mean, to be not to put too far in a word,
because they've been trying. Labour has been trying this
I'll
week
say,
to spin it up a bit.
Trying is the word. Yes, they have. They've been trying, and in the spirit of it almost being the end of January, I suppose we should be generous. I'm not quite sure why. Anyway, should we have?
Yes.
In the spirit of transparency, a bit of the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, speaking at Siemens Healthineers in Oxfordshire on Wednesday morning about growth.
Now is the time to grasp the huge opportunity in front of us. By backing a third runway at Heathrow, we can make Britain the world's best connected place to do business. That is what it takes to make decisions in the national interest. And that is what I mean by going further and faster to kickstart economic growth.
It was a very strange and long speech, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean it
felt like a kind of mini budget, didn't it?
It was a strange thing because obviously its principal purpose was to communicate a new impatience. Further and faster appeared many times as a phrase, but its language was quite technical, and so it was obviously principally aimed at the media secondarily, but I think primarily the investment community, because I think she just got back from Davos, and I think that the background to all of this is obviously the growth is not great, and they know that they really need to kickstart it pretty sharpish, and so it made me, and we can perhaps talk about this, to think about the whole future of speechifying, really, because what it lacked totally was a sort of popular appeal. But okay, let's sort of give her due. It did mark a change of tone from the sort of gloom and doom we've had. So
they've definitely, as my kids say, they've definitely switched up.
Yes.
Keir Starmer, and let's give them, as you've just said, let's give them some credit because they bloody well needed to. Because they set out, as we know, totally 100% wrong tonally. And then they've seen Trump come in, and Trump has talked up America.
It's really interesting that, I think that's absolutely 100%. And you're right that they sort of needed to anyway, but I think you're so right that Trump is the kind of, was the straw that broke the camel's back in this regard. I talked to someone, as they say, who has a claim to know the mind of Keir Starmer yesterday, and who said that Trump's sort of the sheer kineticism of Trump has changed this person said the whole playbook has changed, and I think this was good because not that it's good for America, but it is good that something has kind of put 20,000 volts through Labour, and this has. But
so, let's get real about kinetic energy.
I don't want to.
Trump's taking it all, and Keir and Rachel Reeves, I'm afraid, are somewhat lacking in that department. In this metaphor, Trump is Lewis Hamilton, right? And they're the Keystone Cops.
They just graduated to an electric scooter. Okay, so it's progress, not perfection, I think is the phrase. So it was kind of an inventory, which is never a good look for a speech, but there was a lot in it. She said okay to a Heathrow third runway, which, as we know, has been going for much of our adult lives as an issue, and the promise is that they'll get consent for the project to go before the end of the Parliament. Then how long it takes to build, I just wouldn't know. She said a decade.
Well, so she said
on the Today
programme this morning, she was asked directly, how soon do you think we'll see wheels on the ground of this new runway? She said within 10 years.
I don't believe that.
I say bullshit.
No, I think that
never.
That was a big mistake because first of all, getting that consent, given the opposition of the mayor and many other,
there'll be a judicial
review, at least one, and possibly going up through the appellate courts, So if they get that consent by the end of this Parliament, that'll be good going. And then actually to get a shovel-ready plan, let alone a runway that's ready to
as I
fly
said
off.
to you, mate, it took me 2 years to build an extension in the back of our house.
Exactly.
Right? It's to build a third runway.
And you weren't battling the mayor and the entire climate lobby.
I was battling Islington Planning Council,
right,
for
which
quite
is bad
some time.
enough. But I mean, imagine
extrapolate out that, you know.
Yes.
And so, but to your point there, where this is where I kind of cringe on her behalf, because there's so much positive about saying, okay, we're open for business, we're making big decisions, we're going to challenge the NIMBYs, all of this. All right, whether you like it or not, at least they are now making progress in a specific direction. But then to hang yourself up and say, and they'll be taken off in 10 years, when, in my opinion, and I think probably yours too, that will obviously be bollocks within 3 or 4 years.
Well,
at the point of the election.
I've now set myself an actuarial target, right? Which is I would like to live long enough
to see
Heathrow's third runway, right? That would be a result from my point of view, right? So that's kind of the way I see it. And I also think, we were discussing this earlier today, you know, the cakeism, the Boris Johnson cakeism, having your cake and eat it, that she adopted on net zero. No one believes that either. I mean, there is, you know, it is absolutely clear. There's a very strong argument, because Heathrow is so different to every other airport in the country, that it does need new capacity. I get that. But it's insulting to pretend that there aren't climate change implications for this.
Matt, what I said to you this morning, which is, again, a source of massive irritation, and it's a symptom of newly found expertise from people who actually don't know what the fuck they're talking about, is this latching onto the argument of, oh no, aeroplane engines are much more efficient now. Aviation fuel is much better than it was previously, and this is now being touted as though, oh, we knew this all along, you know, and this is now why it's possible. Well, it would be much more honest to say, look, there's going to be a trade-off, and we're going to have to find that net zero capacity somewhere else.
No, absolutely.
But this is going to affect the climate.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And you know, it reduces, if you're trying to do something which is, let's face it, it's symbolic to say there's going to be a third runway at Heathrow, because it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen on her time as Chancellor, even if she's a very successful Chancellor. I mean, Gordon Brown was Chancellor for 10 years. It's not, you know. I mean, her timetable is 10 years, but that's a very long period of time as Chancellor, and something tells me she won't be Chancellor for 10 years. But this kind of, it's going to be cost-free, it's going to be it's going to be neutral in terms of it's carbon neutral. No one believes that. And it one of my favourite all-time private eye covers from the 80s was when Cecil Parkinson was Energy Secretary, and it had him saying, higher prices means cheaper electricity for all, right? And this is one of those moments, right, where, you know, it's a bigger runway, a bigger airport, you know, with thousands of planes belching, you know, emissions into the air means a healthier climate for your children. That's right. That's just silliness. And it makes them, you know, look unserious, I think. And that's a problem, because there are lots of other things they were announcing which were smaller, going down to the rail corridor between Oxford and Cambridge, Lower Thames crossing, the regeneration of Old Trafford. I mean, very little in it, to be honest, was new. But the sort of framing was that, you know, that it was one of overall tone and urgency.
And by the way, just to pause on because people might think I'd instinctively be against the regeneration of Old Trafford, because, you know,
I think the nation is agog.
Its continued crumbling is far to behold. But, you know, I don't know the Old Trafford area as well as I know the Goodison and Anfield areas of Liverpool, for instance.
Yeah, you wouldn't like it if it was Goodison, would you?
No, exactly. But this is my point. These great football stadia do happen to be located in areas of relative deprivation, you know, and so it's fantastic to know that there is going to be government money to finally do something it's positive around these places.
I was pleased by that, and you know, they've got Sebastian Coe working on it and everything. It's good, but I think that, I mean, you said to me that it wouldn't survive the first question from Beth Rigby. Well, she wasn't actually in the audience, but, you know, the sort of the force of your point was absolutely proved once we got to Q&A, because, you know, she was terrible on immigration, because they're going to have to sort this one out, which is, if you want growth, you're going to have to stop talking about bringing immigration down. And as we've been saying on the pod endlessly, talk about each sector and talk about it intelligently and with confidence. And, we know that, for example, the building industry needs 225,000 extra workers by 2027, which is very soon. And
is that including all of these projects? Or maybe that's just as things stand.
That's an extremely good point. Because, no, I mean...
Who's going to build this runway?
That figure predated yesterday, so more.
Yeah.
And in answer to Christopher Hoke from GB News, she said, no, we're going to bring immigration down. Next question. And I thought, again... don't insult the intelligence of the people you're trying to impress, which in that speech specifically, as I said, was the investor community, was the media. What they're trying to do is they know, and they're right, that one of the reasons that growth is so poor is that investors like stability, and they were very unimpressed by Rishi Sunak cancelling HS2 and going soft on net zero targets. Not because investors are virtuous and love net zero, but they like to know what they should be planning for, and that those two things injected a sort of culture of instability into the idea of investing in investment in this country. And she is right, and Starmer is right, that a new stability is essential, but it has to be based on rationality and logic. And I'm afraid on a lot of points, there are too many holes in the argument.
Yeah.
But let's sort of stick to the original idea and think, okay, then what? I mean, I think that what she really needs to do urgently, because in fact the clock is ticking very fast for her. This was all about long-term plans. And by the way, we always object to politicians not thinking strategically. So one has to sort of say fair enough, when they do. But there's another side to it, which is they have to find a way of selling their economic strategy on the doorstep.
Yeah.
They just haven't. I mean, talking about a plan to change, what is the retail offer? What is the doorstep offer? The only thing that the electorate really knows this government has done in that zone is the winter fuel allowance cut and the fact that some taxes are rising in April.
Yeah, and the only thing people will remember from this speech, despite all the the plethora of smaller projects, which I think there was a project in Cornwall, which tiny but important to people in Cornwall, right? So that's all good.
It was a bit skewed south, I thought, as well.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I mean,
it really was.
It was definitely skewed England. There was but anyway,
South England,
southeast England, got the if you take Oxford and Cambridge as being the other big kind of project.
Exactly. So, I mean, fine, but what about the other parts of England?
But I was trying to think about an analogy for the predicament they're in, because and having just spent a weekend in Brighton celebrating a birthday, I thought it's a little bit like the owner of a shabby rundown hotel deciding that they, knowing business is falling off, it's in decline, they know they've got to reinvest, do the whole place up, put another star on, so it goes from 2-star to 4-star, whatever, and going to have to borrow a significant amount of money to refurb the whole place. In the meantime, sort of slow things down in your existing business. While you get the refurb done, and then facing your new business, hoping that all your beliefs and faith in the new market come true, facing greater debt repayments because you've had to borrow at high interest, and getting through that period of outgoings without increased revenue. And that's what the next 4 years are going to look like for a Labour government. It's all going to be spend and investment without income. And you're not going to see the bump in growth.
And she's
that
very
this is
close to her own fiscal ceiling, its self-imposed fiscal ceiling. I mean, there are long-term timeframes and short-term ones, and the short-term one, which is causing huge angst in Labour circles and indeed business circles, is March 26th, which is when the next really important Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts come out, which is also the day of the spring statement. And if those forecasts suggest continued low growth, that's really bad because the April national insurance rises will then come in, and they will hit a lot of small businesses. You know, she had to raise taxes, to be fair, but you know, there'll be a lot of grumbling. Spending review in June, but crucially in between, we've got the May local elections. Now, Labour is quite well placed in terms of the elections that happened before. These places where the elections are being held in county councils, the last time they were contested was just after the vaccine bounce. So the Tories did artificially well. So Labour should do quite well.
Yeah.
But obviously the real challenge is keeping the reform game down.
Yeah.
It needs to be good. And so that immediate sort of short to medium term horizon is very difficult for her and Starmer.
The other thing that, you know, I'm sure a lot of our listeners, dear listeners, will be thinking, if not screaming at the podcast, is what about Brexit? She was asked, Chris Mason asked her, look, Chancellor, and it was great actually to hear somebody of Chris Mason's impartiality and stature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Putting it to her so straight.
He
said to her so straight, he said, look, if you want growth, if you're serious about growth, there's one thing you can do right now which will reverse a lot of the damage that's been done since 2016, and it's rejoin a common market, rejoin the single market, rejoin a customs union, and rejoin the single market. And her response to this was, and I don't mind, you can make an argument about why you should or why you shouldn't, but she made the worst argument in response to that question, which was, well, it was in our manifesto.
Nobody cares.
We're going to stick to our manifesto.
Nobody cares.
A manifesto is a huge, broad document, and you can't pick out things and say, that's what people voted for.
Here's the problem with that argument from her, is that manifesto U-turns, to my mind, actually are massively overrated as a big deal, because I think voters understand that sometimes situations change. They're only a really big deal if you are facing an opposition of absolute thunderous power.
Yes.
And I think we were talking about Prime Minister's questions yesterday, Wednesday. It's safe to say that Kemi Badenoch and the Tories are not that.
How mediocre is Kemi Badenoch, by the way?
I mean, I think it's a problem obviously it's a huge problem for the Tories. I mean, at the moment they're nowhere. They really are nowhere, and I don't see any I don't see any reason to think that will change.
Yeah.
But that's a problem for Starmer, because it would help him if he could point to the alternative and say, well, you don't want them. You know, Blair, even William Hague, who at the time was treated as something of a figure of fun, had a front bench of some substance. And, you know, Blair was cleverly able to say, well, you don't want them back. You remember him saying weird, weird, weird. And it's going to be very hard for Starmer to say,
because she's not. It's not
the Badenoch menace. I mean, it just that doesn't fly. The problem is that his real enemy isn't even in front of him. You know, it's Nigel Farage, or Mr. Fridge, as we now refer to him on this podcast. And who knows what? I mean, it's TBD how big a threat that is. Yeah. But every Wednesday, he has this jousting match, and he's no great shakes at PMQs either. I mean, he beats Badenoch regularly, but, you know, she's no good. So that event has ceased to have any real significance, I think. Yeah. And it's a problem for them, because for this plan for change, as it's excitingly named, to work, there needs to be a sense that it's imperiled by wicked Tories who, if they, you know, are on the verge of coming back and taking us back to Dickensian times. Yeah. Whereas, in fact, the greater risk is that Reeves's numbers won't add up, and she'll have to come back and add more tax rises, and then it gets really nasty, spending cuts.
Yes, I did get some succor from two strange places this morning on X. One from Alan Sugar and one from Piers Morgan, of all people. So Alan Sugar did an interview with BBC News very early this morning. This is Thursday morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and said, and I don't know what the question was, but his answer was, in my lifetime, the biggest catastrophe is Brexit. It's been an absolute disaster. It was a huge mistake. If I was the Prime Minister, and this is a quote, I'd get on my bloody hands and knees and go and beg the European Union to take us back. Piers Morgan on Twitter yesterday said, it's clear Brexit has failed. It's doing national harm to the economy. We can't even protect our borders, which was the whole bloody point. Now is the time for a second referendum. Now, I know Piers, and we've had this debate now he has moved from, look, I voted Remain, but I respect the wishes of the referendum, etc., fine. And anybody who calls for a second referendum is basically betraying democracy. He's now in that zone himself.
Yes.
So there is a definite movement towards this ask the question again.
There's no question at all that national opinion has shifted dramatically. The problem is Starmer, I think, and indeed Reeves, but let's focus on Starmer. Starmer, as we know, is absolutely drenched in European law, culture. That's him. That's what he is. Yeah. He literally wrote the book on European law. And as a consequence, he thinks, again, as it was put to me, was that he thinks his acceptance of Brexit, having been, a strong argument, the shadow Brexit secretary, and a strong advocate of second referendum, and and so on, that his decision to say, right, red lines, we're not going back in, we're not going back into the single market, we're not going back into the customs union, that was his clause 4. Yeah. Now, the difference is that Blair's clause 4 was a good idea, right? Yeah. Whereas this has locked him into a position of total constraint and total inflexibility, which is absolutely disastrous.
I think you're absolutely right to read it as a character flaw, because
he is very cussed.
As I've mentioned on this podcast, in the early days of the New European, he used to phone us up and say, listen, Jeremy's saying this, but read between the lines. There's a game being played. It's all about the long game. Yeah. And the objective is to, try and get some reversal of this. Now, he used to tell me that on the phone. And that's the opposite of his stance right now.
Yeah, I think the tragedy is that I certainly held out a naive hope that once in office, he would come into his own, and with this huge majority, which he still has, he would actually have the guts to say, look, when the circumstances change, so do I, and we would not necessarily right now, but in due course, we'd be looking at a change. I have to say, and I say this with no pleasure, I don't think as long as Keir Starmer is leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister, that there'll be a shift on Europe.
I think you're right.
I think there'll be a reset, which will be nice, but I think that the idea of a serious, rethink on this is post-Starmer.
There we go. Okay. Good. Well, not good, but thank you. I agree, to be fair. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about a film that rocked both of us.
Very much so.
So enjoy the short break, come back, and we'll talk about this great movie. Matt, you saw it first. I saw it on your recommendation. It's The Brutalist. And I think we both feel that it's one of the most important and best films that we've seen for a long, long time.
Very long time. It's the favourite to win Best Picture at the Oscars on March the 7th, and I think it should. It tells the story of a Hungarian Holocaust survivor and architect, a Bauhaus architect called Laszlo Tóth, played brilliantly by Adrien Brody.
Brilliant performance.
Comes to America, lives in considerable, indigence for a while, and then is sort of picked up by a bluff industrialist called Harrison Lee Van Buren, wonderful name, played again brilliantly by Guy Pearce, who is taken by the idea of having a pet architect and artist to build minimalist architecture and Bauhaus architecture, which is very much in vogue. And he commissions Laszlo to build a sort of edifice to his late mother.
Yeah.
And the film is, and listeners stand by. It clocks in at 250 minutes plus an intermission, which may put a lot of people off.
Yeah.
But I think we both found that it didn't feel like a drag.
No, and we should explain, because I'm sure everybody knows what brutalism is.
Yeah,
but I did say to a mate, I saw this great film, you should see it, Brutalism, and he said, well, why is it called The Brutalist? Right, and brutalism is a school of architecture, and it's very much can be applied to other disciplines as well, but mainly associated with architecture.
Yes,
and it's those kind of concrete, massive,
like the National Theatre,
like the National Theatre or the Barbican,
or the things that the King Charles hates.
Yeah, it's all the carbuncles,
monstrous carbuncles.
But I mean, things I actually adore. I love
it. No, I love it, and I think that one of the many reasons this film is worth seeing is because in the various dialogues the relationship at the heart of this movie is Laszlo the architect and Harrison the patron.
Yeah.
And their conversations about why Laszlo believes that architecture has a special capacity to capture ideas and endure is very striking. And there's a very moving moment when Laszlo, who's on his uppers, is first approached properly by Harrison, and Harrison has a portfolio of Laszlo's surviving work in Europe, which he thought had been
laid waste
during the war. But also, a point that is often underestimated is that the Nazis hated Bauhaus. They thought it was Jewish architecture, and suspect.
Yeah.
And so Laszlo's tearful with joy that his buildings still survive, and that's a very big part of it. But there were so many other themes, weren't there?
But he also, what I found interesting, and I can't help but connect it to the first part of this podcast, was this fictional character Laszlo's belief that his buildings stood for something. They meant something, and they were the essence of renewal and of hope for the future. And as Corbusier, another great
architect,
Bauhaus-inspired architect, would say, that they pointed to a design for life, and a new way of living. And I thought of Francois Mitterrand in France, and the tradition in France of presidents having these grands projets, of making grand architectural statements about that would give a nation a sense of purpose and hope and inspiration.
Yes.
And I did think it's not the fucking third runway at Heathrow, but we could do with something like this. And actually, ironically, because I've got so little time for him, I think Boris Johnson had that sense of
he loved the grand projet. I mean, actually, the two politicians sort of our time who've had that are Michael Heseltine and Boris Johnson. Which is some might find surprising, but to be fair to them, and you're right, they both had that. And
just as an aside, Heseltine's great grand projet was the Liverpool Garden Festival,
exactly,
which was really instrumental in lifting that city up by its bootstraps.
And I think that sense of, Tony Crosland in his famous "The Future of Socialism," talked a lot about the role of architecture, and I think that has got lost in statesmanship a bit. This notion that great civic edifices can mean something really important. I think you'd have to travel quite a long way to find some. Now you have the Trump thing that everything is real estate. That's not what this is. This is something much more cerebral and much more civic minded.
Well, there's a sense of great socialism in building for the people, isn't it? And maybe, to be fair, the Old Trafford, Andy Burnham's Old Trafford plan,
I think you're right. I think oddly enough, the sort of the sports mega stadiums of today are perhaps the closest you get to that ambition and aspiration.
Let's get back to the movie though, because there's so much to talk about.
There's so much to talk about. The question to ask is, why has it been so resonant? Because the architecture is part of it, but the history of the film is interesting because it nearly didn't get made. It's only the third feature film by this quite young guy, Brady Corbet, And unbelievably, it cost him less than $10 million, which is just extraordinary.
I mean, just when you consider there's actual major construction as part of it.
Yeah,
it's
and
incredible.
there's a huge section in Italy where they go to a beautiful quarry.
Wonderful, the Carrera marble quarry.
Exactly,
yeah.
and I mean, I can't work out, given how much movies cost nowadays. I can't work out how they did it, and I think it's.
We must do a feature on that in the New European, because it's such a stunning landscape that
it really is, and it is also, without spoiling, it becomes the scene of one of the darkest moments in the film. But there are other themes in it as well. I mean, one is, okay, why is it resonating so far? One is that I think it's got the idea of America embedded in it, because Laszlo goes there as his cousin, played by Alessandro Nivola, a very great actor too, has totally assimilated,
changed his name, hasn't he?
Changed his name, become a Catholic, married a Christian woman, and wants nothing to do with his Jewish past, right? He's bought into the 1940s, 1950s American dream. Laszlo doesn't do that. He still goes to synagogue, but he, interestingly, doesn't want to go to Israel when it's founded. And so there are two bits there. One is that we're right now confronted with a maniac president who's in real time redefining what America is, and it's a very different America to the one Laszlo arrives in, for all its flaws. It's a much more nativist America. And also, this film was, as I said, was started 7 years ago, long before the horrors of October the 7th and the terrible carnage in Gaza. But I mean, it would be idle to deny that it's sort of exploration of what Israel is, what Zionism is, why Laszlo is is nervous of the concept, whereas his wife and his niece embrace it. It feels very topical, doesn't it? It feels really very contemporary.
Does. It's great. And there was a chilling line in it where I thought summed up the spirit of Laszlo as opposed to the spirit perhaps of his wife. And it was when he described the Holocaust as a humiliation.
Yes.
He said it was a humiliation. And I'm not Jewish, but I felt like, well, actually that's an interesting, we're sitting here in the week of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. But it was such a great expression of anger at what had happened.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because this is one of the greatest and most dark and controversial elements of the Jewish response to the Holocaust, which is, if you go back to Primo Levi and If This Is a Man, which is arguably the greatest first-person book about the Holocaust, the title is taken from a poem Primo Levi wrote when he was in Auschwitz or shortly thereafter, called If This Is a Man. He's asking, am I still a man? Ask yourself if this is a man. And in that wonderful Jonathan Glazer movie, The Zone of Interest, there was this appalling way in which the camp commandant at Auschwitz, you could hear the screams and noises of the atrocities and genocide going on over the wall, but they were not part of the film.
That's right.
And that was part of the humiliation.
That's an extraordinary film as well.
Again, and it's the survivor guilt is often talked about in lots of contexts, but I think you're spot on that a lot of Holocaust survivors, and they're a dwindling number now, felt Holocaust shame, and this is an appalling trauma to deal with. And I think that Laszlo's predicament is what to do about that, and it's not an accident. I think that he turns to hard drugs, and that creates all sorts of problems as well.
And we should say that this isn't a film about the Holocaust per se.
No, not at all.
It's not, in fact, a film about. I mean, as you said, the biggest theme is probably the relationship between an artist striving to do something and his patron. That's the biggest theme. But within its kind of sprawling mass, and like it passed. It didn't feel like it has an intermission, and I didn't feel like it needed it. I was ready for it to. But I suppose if you need to pee more than once every 3 hours, that's what that was for. I think that was
quite artful because for two reasons. One, I think that he loved the idea of the old-fashioned double bill. Right?
Yes, yeah.
And also because I have heard the director say this in interviews, that the first, again, not to spoil the movie, but the first half of the movie is quite well behaved in the sense that it's a fairly linear and structured,
nicely told story. Yeah.
But the second half is completely off the hook. He just lets all the constraints off, and we go 60 miles an hour.
We certainly do. And then there's an epilogue at the end,
and there is a very surprising,
has a crushing effect.
I mean, it is. I mean, to call it a twist is makes it sound like a detective story, and it really isn't that. But it's a sort of coda that leaves you thinking, oh, hang on, and I think that there's a general sense. I mean, it's being compared to a lot of movies, and rightly so. But it's also, I think it fits into the literary tradition of the great American novel,
right?
In that it just runs towards big, difficult subjects.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah.
I love that about it, because movies are increasingly becoming either one of two things, right? Which is either very, very poorly funded, struggling indie films, which find it hard to get any. I mean, for example, Mike Leigh's new film, which opens on Friday, fantastic, Hard Truths. He couldn't get money for Love Nor Nothing, went to Netflix. This is Mike Leigh, right? Yeah. One of the great directors in the world, right? He's got 50 years of really, really terrific films under his belt. Yeah. And, there's no market amongst, as far as funders are concerned, for intimate, movies of the sort he's a genius at.
Yeah.
And then the other side is Mission Impossible 19, Fast and Furious 10, Captain America and the Lost Ark, and it just I like those movies.
Yeah.
I'm shallow, Hidden Shallows. I love all that, right? But it does bother me a lot that we're going to miss out on the movies that are just that great period we often talk about, the 70s. The Chinatown and just before Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider and all that sort of stuff. Scorsese. That. What will happen to their generation? And I think that he has, that Courbet has kind of in this film thrown down the gauntlet and said, look, I spent just $10 million to produce this fucking masterpiece, right? Go out and do the same.
That's right.
It's very inspiring in that respect.
It is. And presumably he'll make his money back, because it's a hard ticket to get. When I went to see it on a Friday night in Holloway Road in Islington at the big Odeon, there was one ticket left, and I got the last ticket.
It's anecdotal, but when you told me that, I was really pleased.
Yeah.
I mean, I was glad you got to see it, but I also thought, that's amazing. I mean, how often does an art house movie last that long, and address the kind of complicated cerebral themes we've been talking about? Pack them in, and it sort of gave me hope, because I think what I think will happen is that directors like him, after they've had a success like this, they sort of form rep companies. Christopher Nolan did, Martin Scorsese did, Paul Thomas Anderson did, and after this, because I expect at least one of Adrien Brody and Guy Pearce will win an Oscar for their performances, big name actors will want to be in his movies, and they'll only get scale pay.
I hope so.
No, but I mean, that's the sort of one for them, one for us. They'll do this sort of movie and then go off and do Captain America and the Jewel in the Nile or whatever.
Well, I read that the sequel to Wolf Hall only got made because Mark Rylance and the director and the producer all agreed to basically work for next to nothing.
And so this is one of the reasons why, I mean, to take Rylance, he quite often appears in character parts in Hollywood movies, and he cops a lot of flack from film critics for being, the tailor or the the psycho, or in the second act of a movie. And I think that's ridiculous, because the reason he does that is because everyone's got to make a living.
Yeah.
But that enables him then to go and work for scale.
Yeah.
in what I think we can all agree was one of the great television masterpiece series of the last 10 years.
Absolutely right.
And that's how it works. But what's great about The Brutalist is that second track continues to exist because, I've gone through, as a lover of movies, I have had sort of moments where I've thought, 10 years from now, will this sort of movie just exist? The streamers are now so dominant. They have all the money, most of the money, and they're not interested in this kind of movie.
Well, let's hope that this experience of this great film, go and see it.
Just go and see it.
Go and see it.
And
let us know
what you think.
Yeah,
because it's the kind of movie where, some people have said, for example, you shouldn't talk about October the 7th in relation to The Brutalist. Rubbish. If it makes you think, and by the way, I use October the 7th as a shorthand, the Middle East crisis. If it makes you think about that and it makes you angry about what Israel's done or what Hamas has done, tell us, that's the point of art.
Go and see it. It's difficult watch in parts. It's definitely not one for the children. But
no, it's not one for the children.
It's a great, great piece of art.
It's what art is for.
Yeah. As is the New European.
Yes. That is, in fact, I think that I could be wrong, but I think that when Brady Corbet made The Brutalist,
he was inspired.
Well, is it a coincidence? I just put this on the table, Matt. And you were there, obviously, present at the creation. I wasn't. Yeah. Is it a coincidence that he started thinking about The Brutalist around about the time that you were founding the New European?
I think the two things are definitely intertwined.
He woke up one morning and, saw the New European and thought...
He said anything is possible.
He thought,
I can do this.
I'm in the gutter, but I'm looking at the stars.
I can do this and I will do this.
And his wife said, Brady, are you sure? A film about an architect? And he said, has Matt Kelly done this for nothing?
It's an analogy.
It's an analogy
for the creation of a small newspaper in London.
Actually, if you look very carefully, there's a little... No, I don't want to spoil it.
Don't spoil it. But anyway, subscribe to the New European. It's a weekly piece of art. And we'll give you, it's the last of our bollocks to dry January weeks.
It is.
So you can get a bottle. You
can't have dry January in February. It's one of the rules.
Fantastic El Reo Plata tequila worth 34 quid, I think. A big bottle of tequila when you subscribe. So if you've been dithering, you've been thinking about signing up, you love the podcast, you're wondering what the newspaper's like, take the plunge, folks. Honestly, you won't regret it. And you'll help us do more and more of this good journalism.
Which is going to make your 2025 fucking brilliant.
Yeah, and for tell me, Matt, how could you make an entire year objectively better for the price of 52 quid?
I don't know.
It actually might be 60 quid, but I don't know. That's inflation for you.
How could you make a year better for 60 quid, Matt?
I mean, you couldn't possibly, could you? It's like a meal for three at Wagamama's, isn't it?
At best. I mean, God, without starters.
For a full year of brilliant journalism.
A year of inspiration and incitement to action, not non-violent, obviously, and just comedy and fun and great analysis and the best writers in London. I almost feel demeaned to have to say it.
Me too. So listen, dear listeners, make my week. Subscribe to the New European.
Make your year.
Make your year. That's a great slogan. Make my week, but make your year.
Like it.
Go to theneweuropean.co.uk/2Matts. That's the number 2, MATTS. And like I say, free bottle of tequila this week and this week only.
Otherwise, we'll come and stand outside your house.
We will. We know where you live. And we know the ones that haven't paid anything. And yet you love it. You never miss an episode. You haven't paid a bean.
Yeah.
What are you thinking of?
With the new TV detector vans. T&E detector vans.
Yes. Send in your feedback, your questions to 2mats@tnepublishing.com. That's the number 2, MATTS, at tnepublishing.com. Thank you as ever to our wonderful production team at Rethink Audio, led by the great Matt Hill. And until Sunday...
It's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from him.
Goodbye.